Oh, okay. Let me prop this up.
Is it a bit quieter there today for you, John?
It is. There's been lots of construction going on here, and they're tearing. Actually, all of Manhattan is in a process of being torn apart and put back together.
Hopefully,
in a way that's going to please corporate America. So it's a really ugly. It's an aesthetic I loathe. It's like really very incredibly sterile. And so I'm seeing all the charm and personality and uniqueness being pretty much destroyed in favor of this corporate logo, which is just about planted its ugly presence in what used to be actual neighborhoods. So that's what happened yesterday. There was construction going on that way, construction going on that way, and my whole apartment was just vibrating with these mixed, and to me they're messages, and I internalize them. So it's not just sound, it's how does that sound turn into some kind of a signal or even a symbol. I think these are the kind of things, oddly enough, that Bateson, both Nora and Gregory are wrestling with, the analogical and the digital. And I was assigned this chapter, so I'm just jumping right in.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Unless you guys had something, I'll just make a few remarks that I hope are useful, because this chapter was extremely challenging. The one we're doing today on form, substance, and difference. It's a conversation. He's actually he's making a speech to a group. I think it's the Korzybski. I don't know if it's a Korzybski group or not, but I think it is. At any rate, so he's in a kind of different discourse event than in some of the previous chapters, because I think he's trying to organize his thoughts and deliver them to an audience of people he describes as being more expert in some ways than he is. So he's sort of offering this kind of transdisciplinary approach to the various problems that everyone seems to be recognizing about what is the organism plus environment. What sort of thing is this, which we call organism plus environment? And I just underlined a few things here. Do you ask what it's made of? Earth, fire, water, etc.? Or do you ask, what is its pattern? And he traces that out in this, in the next following paragraphs. And he's talking about the unit of survival as a flexible organism in its environment. He goes on to ask, what is it in the territory that gets onto the map? And he elaborates upon all of that. And then he goes into difference and what is difference? The difference that makes a difference. So he has many questions here and some suggestions, I think. I feel like some of this is ahead of our time. Some of it is a little bit behind where we are. I think many researchers have moved beyond him in many ways and have answered and have deconstructed that whole idea of organism plus environment. And I think that's ongoing. I just wanted to, but I do, and I also want to fast forward a little bit into Nora, because I think it's very complementary. She is often, Gregory talks about the next 20 years, like 20 years from now, 30 years from now. Hopefully the kind of questions that he's raising will have been resolved. Well, Nora, of course, is in his future when he was writing about this in the 70s and the 80s and in the 90s. And she, of course, is adding on something, many decades after his death. So I think it's very interesting that what she sort of adds on. She's talking about, I'm skipping ahead to something that we didn't read today, but it's going to read next week, on parts, wholes, hope, and horror. She's talking about, where are the parts? Where are the wholes? The tidiness of identifying compartmentalized parts and wholes creates muddles at other levels. For one simple instance of this, isn't the difference between parts and wholes to some extent a matter of scale? Taking the examples of a family member in a family and a tree in a forest, it is clear that the person is a whole system, and so is the family of which they are a part, just as the tree is a whole system within the whole ecosystem of the forest. Scaling up and scaling down, we can identify the systems within systems. Scaling down, both the human being and the tree have systems for reproduction. Scaling up, both the forest and family are part of a still larger landscape. A piece of music can be arbitrarily divided up into the instruments playing. Each instrument could be considered a part, or each stanza with all the instruments playing could be considered a part, or the song itself could be called a part of a genre. So once again, that question, what are the parts? Where are the wholes? I'm reminded of contemporary, I think it was Morton, Timothy Morton. You know, there's that truism that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and he reverses that and says the parts are greater than the sum of the whole. Anyway, I think she's describing something that others have called, Wilbur calls holonic. We are parts wholes. And I think that it's useful, but it's also limited. And I'm going to skip over to someone else who's a Batesonian at heart. Her name, and I realized her name is Lee Starr. She wrote this wonderful book called Boundary Objects and Beyond. And she's talking about codes. And I bring her up because I had a dream. And in the dream, I was lucid. I was sitting on a couch with this mysterious woman who was telling me, who was communicating telepathically, something of great interest to me. And that's when I realized, oh, I'm having a dream and there's this strange woman giving me all these messages. And I turned to her and I said, who are you? And she said, my name is Star. And I was sort of startled by that response. I woke up and noted it. And that day I was in the bookstore, my favorite used bookstore. It's gigantic. I was in the philosophy section, and I noticed the title. I noticed the author, Star, on the cover of this book. And so I purchased it, and it's called Boundary Objects and Beyond. And I felt a relation, and then I found out that the author of this book had died in her sleep about 10 years ago. She was a quite intelligent and accomplished systems theorist, and I think this book is a compilation of some of her best essays and some of the essays that others have written about her. And I found it an extremely interesting, because I think she's takes a lot of what Bateson was offering as he's moving from a first order to a second order to a potential third order cybernetics, or it wouldn't even call it cybernetics, it'd be called systems theory, or beyond that even. And I think this is what Nora is wrestling with. And how are we going to save systems theory? Or how are we going to elaborate upon some of the basic ideas which, had been shelved, really. I mean, early AI looks incredibly crude to most people who are in the field of AI. And and I think this is an ongoing challenge for all of us. And about code, Anyway, where do codes come from? This is from Lee Starr's essay called Living Grounded Theory. What is a code? And then she talks about her experience of a bobcat who comes up on her lawn. And she says, at some emotional level, I want to know this bobcat. I feel kinship with her. She is beautiful. I feel somewhat attached to her, as if I would like to capture her wildness and beauty and make it part of me. But I know that to do so in real life would be to kill that beauty. So I begin to think with grounded theory feelings about this little relationship. As I think about this and abstract the relationship, a code forms that both adds and subtracts from the experience. Out of bounds is not the total of my experience or relationship with the bobcat. However, the combination of empathy or attachment and abstraction is even more powerful than either alone. In working with biologists, I have felt this dual vision. If they see a subject within their expertise, they're compelled to name it, often in Latin. Almost simultaneously, they will say something empathic, like, hey there, little fella, or what a beauty, or as frequently, sorrow about the condition of its habitat. In fact, each part of science has some version of this double vision. A code, then, is a matter of both attachment and separation. When I am able to hold both simultaneously, I experience the joy and grief of adulthood. So I think she says, I resonate with that. I think a lot of this is vibratory, really. We're working with very fuzzy categories, very fuzzy logic, and with boundaries that are ever shifting. And what's in and what's out is negotiated at those boundaries. And ultimately, we may find, many of us are already saying that in and out doesn't make much sense anymore. So we're moving more and more into the quantum. And researchers like, I can't remember her name, she just read a wonderful book. She's talking about intra-action. I think that makes a lot more sense to some of us than this inside-outside dilemma. I'm going to quote one more thing from James Baldwin, one of my favorite authors. He was gay and he was black, and he was asked, wow, you were gay and you were black. That must have been a real challenge. And he said, oh no, I consider that a blessing, actually. He felt like he had hit the jackpot. And I feel he also said something about his own novels were really kind of weird for the time, because he was talking about gay people, bisexuals, black people, white people. They were all falling in love with each other, bisexuals, and having, back in the 50s, these very complex networks of relationships and affective zones and music and culture they were sharing. And this is a novel he wrote called Another Country, where I think he had this, all these very unusual, for that time, kinds of characterizations and kinds of relationships. But he said, black people are inside white people, and white people are inside black people. And I think when he said that in the 50s, I think that raised a lot of eyebrows. But to me, that seems like so obvious to many of us now, that the inside and the outside, the exterior, the interior, the exterior, the internal, the external, these are all very subtle differences, but they are differences that make a difference. So I'm sharing that with you guys, and very curious about your response. I have a lot more I think I could generate here, but I think it's more important to start a trialogue so we could all share our perplexities and maybe some triumphs. Maybe something has really broken through to another level. I hope that happens at the end of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. That was a short introduction, but I'm going all over the place with where to take the conversation. I feel like it's beyond my control, but I did state to Jeffrey that this chapter, at least the core chapter, we read Gregory Bateson, awoke my inner Bateson, I suppose. And I'm starting to take pieces from what we've read in the past. But I was guided to read I'm drawing a blank now. What was the book I mentioned, Jeffrey? Jeez. It's 2 books after this book, not mine.
Where Angels Fear to
Right.
Tread.
Where Angels Fear to Tread. But I read the first 100 or so pages of that book, and I feel the pieces are being put together very nicely. And we often say that, oh, this is the core turnaround for Bateson, or this is where he finally make his point. Just like his essays will typically start out kind of messy, slow, and then he'll tag on something at the end that makes you think, and then you have to go back and reread, and oh, now I understand what he was getting at. This one, as you're saying, he opens up a lot of questions between organism and environment, the map and territory, like what from the territory carries over onto the map. And he explores it a bit in this speech that he's giving. But in Angel's Fear, he's really trying to hone in and flesh that out and make it real. I'm still a novice. So when I hear all of these parts, of course, to make it a whole, I feel like Angel's Fear is kind of the whole coming together. But at the same time, he makes statements of, well, yes, these are ground. I'm still officially laying the groundwork, and it's up to the rest of us to continually make the process. So his definition of mind, for example, he realizes it's been done in the past before, all the way back to certain religious takes on what one mind is, and so he's not saying this is the way, and he's opening it up to future revisions. But that was what I'm taking his core of cybernetics as being that accumulation from the past and an emerging mind out of these discoveries, and bridging together the various disciplines that are siloed in certain ways.
So there are some nice references there, Doug. The Angels Fear to Tread was a read a long time ago. I have to revisit it actually after it was part of my intention was to finish Steps and then reread Where Angels Fear to Tread. I do find when I reread, because of this Steps is a rereading, I find that my memory of Steps has diminished, and I'm constantly surprised by the things that I obviously I rediscover in Bateson because I read it before, but that I had forgotten, because when we deal with such a complex work in memory, it tends to get reduced down to a few sort of main arguments that is what we retain, and we miss the complexity of the complex argument. So again in this text. I kind of see what you mean, Johnny, about it being in some ways dépassé, but it's also so relevant still to the context today. And of course, you know, his warnings that he gives, you know, don't listen to any politician who hasn't got it. It's so relevant to today's world, you know. I mean, find me a politician who does get it. I can't. I don't think I can point to anybody in the political world who really understands these issues. I have a huge number of notes, but I will try not to get into them all and focus on some things, some of which, anyway, Johnny has talked about. Korzybski was somebody I read. I'm not sure if I read it before Bateson. I think I read him before Bateson. So it's a very big brick called Science and Society, which Science and Sanity, which is also a Batesonian argument, right? Because in a sense, that's what we're talking about in this text and in Nora Bateson's text, is how do we manage a more sane approach to all of these complex issues, right? So it's very Batesonian. And Korzybski is, of course, as he points out, the originator of this expression that has become part of the culture. The map is not the territory. But essentially, Korzybski's book, it's kind of got a kind of family resemblance to the arguments that or the discussions we have with Lisa, what's her name?
Morawski, Lisa Morawski.
Morawski, yeah, because which is the role of language in confusing us, right? So in enriching us, but in confusing us, right? So Korzybski is this argument that that the map is not the territory. The apple, the word apple is not the apple that we eat. The apple that we eat is something very different from the way that we use the word, and people get confused between the words that describe things and the actual things, and this is part of the sort of modern problem, if you like, that we need to untangle these confusions in order to to move forward. So and Korzybski did this by drawing on, his book is essentially a kind of survey of all the sciences of the time when he was writing, which was in I think it's the mid 40s or the early 40s or something, or so it was or even 30s, I can't remember now, but it was a kind of a 20th century science after quantum physics, but before a lot of the biological and so forth discoveries that were made. And so it's dated in terms of its understanding of modern science, but it does make this attempt to draw linkages between the different sciences in order to underline the study of this problem of the separate, or the distinction between language and reality, right? So it was also very transdisciplinary, which is why I think Bateson is kind of prefacing his comments to the fact that he's talking to a group of people who are in their own interests grounded in this very strong transdisciplinary, which is this field called general semantics, which was founded by Korzybski. So this is the sort of lead into this talk, and it is relevant and interesting. The organism and environment, of course, is, although it's an argument that that people understand in the academic world, as I say, in the political and corporate world, nobody really gets it yet. I mean, they should, where we are now, but anyway. He talks at one point, so clearly he says the territory is ding and sick, and you can't do anything with it. Always the process of representation will filter it out so that the mental world is only maps of maps of maps ad infinitum. All phenomena are literally appearances. And this, of course, is the problem with AI, because AI is dealing with these maps of maps and maps. All AI is mapping. And it doesn't deal with the real world at all, right? And the real world has aspects to, so Bateson kind of skirts around this issue a bit, because in a way he's interested in cybernetics, which is the treatment of information, and his model of mind is very grounded in information theory. So the difference which makes a difference is an information theoretical concept, right? So he doesn't actually say that mind is only an information processor, but he kind of only talks about the information processing aspect of mind. And it tries to challenge certain preconceptions about what that means, right, in using cybernetic theory. But of course, mind is not just, I mean, mind, and let's say not say mind, but let's say a human being is not just an information processor. A human being has other properties as well, and that have to do with the inexplicability of reality, right? The fact that you cannot entirely grasp what's going on in reality by describing it by language, by, you know, so he kind of skirts this issue. If anything, if I have a kind of criticism towards Bateson, is that he never fully engages with this problem. He's more interested in the information processing side of things, and he never fully engages with the ding and sick side of things. Now, he did say he's not a philosopher, so and the ding and sick is a philosophical preoccupation, and he does sort of, so he also he brings in this argument about Blake, and of course I'm in the process of reading Blake right now, so I found this particularly interesting that he brings Blake into it, because I think he actually has a text about that later on, that Blake is, so Blake has this idea that that human experience is divided into two pieces, what he calls perception, but is also related to reason, which is bounded, and imagination, also related to desire, which is unbounded. And so the infinites come from the desire imagination, and the finites come from the perception reason. And this is related to this pleroma creatura division that Bateson talks about. And he, you know, so, and Blake is also this idea that human beings are ultimately, so this idea of poetic genius, that we all have in us a poetic genius, but the poetic genius is the divine part. For Blake, imagination, desire, the limitless are divine, and we humans have re-separated the world into pieces, subject, object, which is certainly part of it, but also the reason and faculties and so forth. These are all kind of limited pieces, right? And Blake is interested in the movement from these limited pieces to the infinite, to recover the divine, in a sense, which is very close to some of the discussions we've had about Sri Aurobindo, which is doing something like that. You know, so there's a parallel between Blake and many of the other things. And of course, what's interesting about Blake is he was doing this 2 centuries ago, not, Sri Aurobindo was writing at the beginning of the 20th century. He was doing it a century before that, which is really quite phenomenal and one of the really interesting things about Blake. Anyway, I know I'm kind of wandering through different things here. Obviously, the relation between Jung and Blake, so the Pleroma Creatura comes from Jung's writing. And Jung draws heavily on Blake as well. There was a bit of an argument where I thought in some ways this text was a Johnny celebration because he opens up the discussion around dreams as being much more than is normally given credence to, and much more important than is normally given credence to. We all know that Bateson has his own limitations in the dream world. He doesn't really understand it, but he at least is open to the idea that there is more going on there than is typically. So he has also this thing where he sort of calls into question the sort of ideas about energy that circulate in the sort of New Age. I mean, New Age was after Bateson, but it was certainly that kind of thinking that he was talking about. It reminded me immediately when I was reading this of Schwartz-Salant's work on the order-disorder paradox, because Schwartz-Salant has an alternative idea about energy, which is actually grounded in the ideas of entropy that come out of Bateson's work. And so there's a way to work with the energy concept, which isn't the classical New Age kind of way, but something more grounded in Jungian psychology, and Gebserian thought. So Schwartz-Salant is a Gebserian thinker. And so the sort of a-conceptual approach of Gebser is partly what this idea of energy in relation to disorder and entropy is a Gebserian idea. So I thought that was interesting to bring that back into the discussion as well. So Bateson says, and I quote, "I suggest that the delimitation of an individual mind must always depend upon what phenomena we wish to understand or explain." End of quote. I think this is a key idea, and another argument against AI, which tends to say, oh, we're going to simulate mind, without really saying what mind is, right? And Bateson says, well, mind is the result of where you draw the boundaries of a mental system. And mental systems, you can't draw the boundaries the way the AI people would like us to draw them, right? So
I felt that. Oh, you just muted yourself, Jeffrey.
That around the brain, like the neurological brain, you can't, that's not a mental system. The mental system is the neurological brain in the body, in the environment. That's the system. So you can't cut off a piece of it and then assume you're going to do something important with it. You have to include the body and the environment because those are part of the circuits, right? And this is the kind of thinking that Bateson is trying to get us to think about.
Just real quick on that quote, it reminds me of quantum theory in a lot of ways too.
Yeah.
Not specifically stating it, but his mind theory is highly aligned with quantum.
Yeah, agreed. He says, if you put God outside and set him vis-a-vis his creation, and if you have the idea that you are created in his image, you will logically and naturally see yourself as outside and against the things around you. if this is your estimate of your relation to nature and you have an advanced technology, your likelihood of survival will be that of a snowball in hell. End of quote. Welcome to the modern world. Then I wanted to, I think I've done Blake. Then I wanted to, the importance of the artist. So we had this discussion last time, and he brings that into the discussion again, where sort of the way forward requires a regrounding in the arts and and poetics, which again perhaps brings us back to the quantum idea, right? The quantization of poetry, quantum poetics, and so forth. But I also wanted to come to the then I guess we have this idea that the self is larger than any normal self we would normally define. So he has this idea that all of ecology is a self of which we are a part. And this leads us into Where Angels Fear to Tread, and his ideas around spirit, if you like, or not religion exactly, but the spiritual, divine, and that role. But I wanted to come to Nora Bateson's. I didn't read ahead like Johnny.
This is a second read for me for both books. I already read this book about a year ago.
But Nora's the two texts we read focus on the problem of dealing with the racism and the isms that we're currently dealing with in our current environment and society. And I had an experience with anti-Semitism this last week, which really resonated with me. I've been going to the synagogue for in Quebec City for some time now, not taking part in the religious part of it so much as the discussions in and around Judaism, and partly because of my own interest in religion, I've been trying to get a handle on Judaism within the larger religious picture. And we had a talk on Sunday about an early experience in Judaic traditions, the beginning of the within about 100 years of the birth of Jesus Christ. So it was in the very early period of the development of these two Christian religion. And there was a fella there who then started to, after the talk was over, to attempt to debunk the concentration gas chamber and all the rest of it, which is kind of argument I've heard before in other contexts. So it's essentially a Holocaust denier, somebody who's proposing that there were no gas chambers, that all of this is bunk, and they draw on a kind of pseudoscientific argument in support of it, which I've heard before also. But essentially, it's anti-Semitism disguised. It's virulent anti-Semitism disguised. And I kind of heard this around the corner of my thinking when I was talking with somebody else. So I finished the conversation with the other person, turned around to look for the other guy, and he'd gone by that point. But I did have several discussions with some of the other people who were there about this man. So there's an example of, if I'd have been a bit more alert, I could have maybe, but it wasn't just me. I mean, several people in the room were aware of the arguments and the problems with the arguments. So but we have a discussion between us about how we deal with this kind of stuff when it comes up another time. It's not an easy thing to deal with. And interestingly, I was driving home from a meeting, I think the next day on the Monday night, and I was listening to the radio, and it was CBC, the Canadian radio broadcasting company, and they were interviewing a guy who was talking about Holocaust deniers and the problems that they raise, and how do you counter these discussions. So it ended up being a synchronistic kind of thing where I actually heard arguments related to the incident that I had experienced the day before. But so Nora Bateson's discussion about this issue, landed right in the middle of something that I was dealing with. And she sort of asked, well, how do you actually deal with this kind of stuff when you witness it? And, although you can think, oh, well, I'll step in fact, when you're actually in the situation, it's not so easy to figure out how to step in. I mean, in an effective way. And you get lost in the complexities of the situation often. And
you can also get killed.
And you can also get killed, indeed.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful what you, and this is a little bit what Nora was saying, was that there's a certain amount of concern for yourself when you do this.
Yeah, and that's for sure.
Yeah. So if you think about I think Angela Merkel in Germany has just suggested that the level of hate around the Jewish question in Germany has now reached a certain level where people are being asked not to wear the little Jewish caps. I can't remember the name for them right now, but just because they're likely to receive violent assaults because of wearing the symbols. So we are again at this point where it's no longer just individual, but at a social level. So anyway, what I wanted to finish up with that was that last time we had a discussion about, so I think in Nora Bateson's, the second text that we read, she says diffused adjustments are more effective in complex systems, which relates to the discussion we had last time about the 20-year plans and the kind of a desire goal approach rather than very targeted individual actions. So this kind of a broader diffuse approach to the ecological problems with which we're faced, but also perhaps also to the social and hate literature, racism, these kinds of issues. Also a diffuse approach that goes beyond the individual seems to be a kind of way forward into this mess. And so that's what I ended up, which responds both to Nora Bateson's questions and to Gregory Bateson's questions, I think, and his issues that he raises. Anyway, a long rambling discussion, but that's some of the ideas that I had that were raised by this text.
Yeah, I'm going to quote from her. She talks about that shameful scene that between the Muslim woman and the older white woman, and I think she made. I like the statement she makes. I was silent. I know I should not have been. I am writing now to abate that silence. Why did I not speak up? I'm not sure. A couple of paragraphs later, she says, there seems to be layers of the unseen, unspoken, and unbreakable protocols around causing a public scene. To me, this is what culture is. Culture is invisible. we're not even aware of it until we break a rule. Then all of a sudden, we know we're in deep shit. We're in trouble. And so every culture is going to generate its own, presuppositions, and it's going to create boundaries in different ways. So I think this is the challenge as we are moving into uncharted territory. Humanity, collectively, we're in this, all the dilemmas and paradoxes that we've been able to offload onto these abiotic systems are, I think, not going to serve us particularly well. I also wanted to, just a brief anecdote. I've had to speak up, not because I wanted to, and not because it was safe, but because I was in a situation. I had many situations where I just had to. One time I was with, let's see, there were two of my companions were white men, and one of my companions was a black man. So it's one black man, 3 white men. We were all gay. We are going to an event out in Brooklyn. So we're going through an all-black neighborhood, and which was not a friendly place to white people. Also, we were young white men. We were in our 20s at this time. But I remember we were on a platform on a subway, and there was a hostile-looking man, a black man, moving towards the 3 of us white guys. And our black friend, our black companion said, "Oh shit, we're in trouble." So he knew something about the energetics of this situation, that this black man was coming at us. And he started to call him, he was starting to, this scrambled syntax around the white devil. He was directing comments towards the 3 white men who were on the platform, and everyone else was black. And I immediately said, interrupted his rant, and he was getting more and more, I could tell he was very violent type. He could have reached for a gun easily and blown us all away. And he was going to threaten us probably with something. And then I heard the train coming, and I said, "I have only one thing to say to you. God is black. God is a black man." And he looked at me, "What are you saying, motherfucker? Who the fuck do you think you are telling me something like that?" He was not expecting that response from me. And as I started to get into that with him, the train came in, the train doors opened, and I told my companions, "Get in." They all got in, and I stepped backwards, and the subway door closed, and we went off. And there was a great relief. But I think these kinds of splits in the social fabric, these different, gay men can be Asian, Indian, black, white, all these different races, and Jewish, and Muslim, and Christian. So we have different ethnicities, different races, who voluntarily, and maybe not so voluntarily, acknowledge a kind of a relational space with one another. So, and then we hook into, because of our mutual affection for one another, larger networks. And I think these kinds of tensions and stresses and alliances that emerge can be fragile at first, but they can also become extremely resilient and generative for the entire culture. The entire culture starts to become more resilient. But it isn't without risk. And so I really appreciate her taken this particular, why she maintained silence, and that, and why some people can't maintain silence, even if they would like to. And, you know, and there are emergencies that are just come at you from nowhere. And these are the kind of things that there is no manual for, and we can't, I think, walk into a room and listen to conversations, and we can sense there's binds and double binds and messages and double messages, maybe even triple messages, but it isn't like we can count them and say, oh, there's bind number 1, and there's bind number 2, and there's bind number 3. I think this is something that Bateson would consider quite laughable, and is why he was very popular among therapists for a while, but he became in disfavor because he basically made fun of these interventions that many therapists were trying to make in these complex networks, which were much more complex than the therapists were. So I think the lovely thing, though, in this essay is that she's embodying in her reflections on her own behavior and the behaviors of others this dilemma. And I believe that's a good sign. Most people don't even go there. They don't reflect very much upon their own behavior in these circumstances. And they passively sort of wish someone else would do something about it. And I think if that becomes epidemic, we are doomed. I believe there are enough people who will come forward and have come forward and are going to do their best they can to re-educate themselves out of this fight, flight, freeze pattern that I think is hardwired in most of us. But I think there's a lot of study that's been devoted to this and the nature of our nervous systems and trauma, and how fight, flight, freeze is adaptive for a reptile, because the reptile can do that, but mammals cannot. So the idea that we hold previous patternings from is an old idea. But I think that idea is very interesting when you're applying it to the shifts that could be happening in our social engagement systems as we start to heal these, the vagus nerve. I'm drawing upon the vagus nerve theory right now. But what we know about the vagus nerve, I've talked about this before, but it starts in the back of the head and it moves down the spine, and it coordinates the viscera, the heart, the lungs, the autonomic nervous system, and how the rest and activity in the organism is modulated through this vagus nerve. It's called the wandering nerve. And so there's some speculation that these kind of fight, flight, freeze patterns, which come from a kind of reptilian sort of mindset, which is fatal in a mammal, because we can't shut down and survive. So this is not a very good idea for us. It's not adaptive for us. So the idea of a social engagement system, which happens when this vagus nerve becomes more active and modulated, and we can. I believe this is what's so interesting about the mind-body problem. It's not a problem if we start to move out of this Newtonian 3D grid into something that is more quantum friendly. So this is a big chunk, and I have to I'd like to chunk it down and chunk it slow. And I think that's difficult to do. But I think she's trying to do that in this chapter, and I think I was previously trying to do that as well when I draw upon my own first-person experience of encountering a different kind of cultural setup and different kinds of, and when my differences are when the others are hostile to my difference. It's okay, it's really cool. Oh, you're different, that's really interesting. But it's, oh, you're different, I'm going to kill you. I've had this experience from a very early age. So I think those, the more flexible you can become in your communication, the more likely you are to survive. And I think this comes out of our first person embodied experience, not from a third person theory. And I think a lot of early AI came out of a third person only orientation, which I believe many of the physicists at the time and a lot of the social thinkers at the time started to realize that's not going to work. So I'm just going to leave you with one quote, one more quote, and it's one by a physicist, John Wheeler, who I think is really articulating this shift from a first person, from a first order to a second order. He says, nothing is more important, this is John Wheeler, nothing is more important about the quantum principle than this, that it destroys the concept of the world sitting out there with the observer safely separated from it by a 20-centimeter slab of plate glass. Even to observe so minuscule an object as an electron, he must shatter the glass. He must reach in. He must install his chosen measuring equipment. It is up to him whether he shall measure position or momentum. The measurement changes the state of the electron. The universe will never afterwards be the same. To describe what has happened, one has to cross out that word observer and put in its place participator. In some strange sense, the universe is a participatory universe. And this I think was Bateson's call also, as he was part of that Palo Alto group who studied family systems very early on. And he, I believe, was one of those, they talked about the one-way mirror, yeah. There was a mirror that separated. The therapist went in one room, the other room was the family, which was being observed by this committee of therapists. In the conference room with the family was a therapist who had a phone. They were all sitting around a table. And the observers behind the mirror who were not observed, they were hidden. They would create an intervention among themselves as they observed what they considered the patterns were of that family. And they would call in an intervention. The therapist would pick up the phone, get the intervention, deliver it to the family. Until someone had the idea, why don't we just break through this glass, this one-way mirror, and why don't we just all get together in one room, see what happens? So the committee of therapists and the family they were observing were in the same room. Then the observers were being observed by the family. And that created all kinds of difficulties that had not been there before. And I think this is moving out of a first order to a second order, where the observer, every observation is made by someone, and every statement that is made to someone. Even if you're alone and you make a statement, you're making a statement to someone. So I think those kind of principles are much more of a second order. And I think we're in this shift, maybe, and I think Nora is moving towards something that I would call third order, although I haven't quite articulated that yet, but I think I've made some attempts at how would one apply that? And I think we've done a few experiments here with mixed results. As I am using a methodology called clean language, I think that Jeffrey and Heather and Marco have been exploring something quantum poetics. And I believe these two ways of working have a strong family resemblance, and I hope we can have some future explorations of those possibilities. You mentioned Lisa Morawski, who was talking about language, and she visited us a couple of times on the cafe, and I had the good fortune of hanging out with her recently. She visited New York, and we were at the MoMA, and we talked about a lot of things. No surprise that we talked about language, and we also did a lot of clean language process. And it was very interesting for me because she's a linguist. She has a linguistic and a philosophical background. So I find that extremely interesting because we share a lot of metaphors. And anyway, so I'm just putting all that out there because I think these are, finding applications is going to be incredibly challenging for all of this theory and meta theory. Because it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. And I think that's what I love about Nora, saying it's not about cracking the code, it's about catching the rhythm. And if there's a lesson reflecting on my own behavior in many tough situations where people were picking up rocks and aiming it at my head, I was able to catch their rhythm. And I could anticipate way before that happened that it could happen. And I think that's being able to triangulate from the margins is a great resource if you have enough people who can do that with you. If you're the only one who can do it, you're in real trouble. But if you are with others who can triangulate from the margins, you can co-create enormous stability so that our group life can have coherence rather than decoherence. You can have coherence and hold many differences that make differences. Decoherent systems can't make differences that make a difference. And I think we're seeing this all over the place. Many our social systems are decohering. Just look at the U.S. Congress and what's happening with the White House, or look at what's happening, in other countries around the world. So I'm just looking at all of these different dynamics, and together I believe that we can find the patterns that connect. And whatever we pay attention to, just because we are paying attention, it changes. And I think this is a very fascinating possibility that the collective unconscious, through our participation, through our observing participation, the collective unconscious starts to change. Anyway, some great ideas here that are circulating in our system, and I'm really enjoying the potential wisdom that can come forward from moving from Jung, Pauli. Lisa was studying Pauli and Jung. They have some correspondence going on. She's teaching a course on this. So I was hoping to get an interview with her. Maybe that'll still happen, that we could post, because I think that's extremely interesting. Because Pauli, a physicist, and Jung had a correspondence, and they had a relationship, a therapeutic relationship. Pauli was in therapy with Jung. But they did a study on synchronicity and the acausal connecting principle, and the whole idea of the inner and the outer in these synchronistic events is called into question. I think that's really very fertile territory to explore. We don't have very good maps for it.
Pauli also is the theoretical physicist who wrote about identity, and that was his contribution, was this idea that certain kind of particles are distinguishable and others are not through their identity, which is very interesting, very interesting set of ideas that Pauli introduced into physics.
That's right. So it's a very fertile area. Schrödinger and Niels Bohr and Einstein. I mean, we still haven't even begun, I think, to scratch the surface of what they were dealing with. But I think you add to that the complexity of what's happening in biology, and looking at biosemiotics, and how organisms are able to, the difference between a sign and a signal and a symbol, and all the kinds of mischief that can happen if you're a symbolizing animal, such as we are. But it's hard for me to believe that that this is just totally a destructive capacity that we have. It could be quite a blessing, and certainly the arts are an example, I think, of symbolizing at our best. You come up with a William Blake, or I'm going to quote somebody again, Gerard Manley Hopkins. He's coming out of, I'm quoting him because just because I am, but I think there's something about the perceptual. And Saving Appearances was written by Owen Barfield. And he's talking about the difference between mysticism and the occult, something we haven't really gotten into. But I think there's he draws up in a brief little poem by J.M. Hopkins, Gerard Manley Hopkins, who I think really does express really beautifully in this little poem the mystery of appearance. He says, "It was a hard thing to undo this knot. The rainbow shines, but only in the thought of him that looks, yet not in that alone, for who makes rainbows by invention? And many standing around a waterfall see one bow each, yet not the same to all, but each a hand's breadth further than the next. The sun on falling waters writes the text, which yet is in the eye or in the thought. It was a hard thing to undo this knot." So anyway, that's my spiel. And I think this fits in also, you mentioned Pleroma and Creatura and Pauli and Jung. I have not read Sermons from the Dead, which I think is where Pleroma and Creatura came from. I'm not particularly fond of that way of categorizing, but maybe I should reread that Jung again. I think that all needs to be updated somewhat. Anyway, I think also about the one-way mirror and when something moves from being one-way communicate to two-way or multiple ways of communicating, we're moving from that whole idea of symmetry and asymmetry. I think this is something that Nora really does really, really well. And she talks about in that poem, I think, just a second, I'll quote this. "Oh, stop that thing you do." She says in the third paragraph, I like this, "Diffused adjustments are more effective in complex systems. Indirect is much more effective, though impossible to prescribe." And I was being very indirect when I told the hostile black man who was coming at me, saying the white man was the devil. I said, "And God is a black man." That sort of destabilized him. And that destabilized him enough so that we could get to something that was safe. So we all got into the train and we departed from that station and that hostile, potentially very hostile situation. And she says, "My thoughts are of the snow on the branches that make beautiful, jagged zebra stripes on the horizon in winter. Symmetry and asymmetry are convivial."
And thank you for that, Johnny. And I also noticed that in that whole discussion about the Muslim woman and the white woman, that Nora Bateson, at one point she drops us into this text. She said, I can't remember, I need to look at the text, but she said something about it's a double bind. Mm-hmm. And, so the black man and the context that you were in was a double bind in the same way. And the way out of a double bind cannot be predicted. It's creative to step out of the bind. The bind is itself totally predictive. But
I would say it was a triple bind, actually. It was gay, it was black, mm-hmm. and there were white people in a black dominant situation, but one member of our group was black. So it was like, I think we're talking about triple.
Or triple double bind or something like that.
Yeah. But this was 30 years ago. And both of those, and all those men that I was with are dead now. So I look back on this I'm the only one who survived. I'm the only one who would remember this scene, except for my opponent in this particular circumstance. But I think he wasn't really my opponent though. I found something that was between us that confused him enough so that he didn't pull out a gun and shoot us. And this was a much more violent city in some ways for certain groups than it is now. But I'm just bringing all of this up because I think it is there is no manual where you can do, step 1, step 2, step 3 in these circumstances. Something comes through you, hopefully, if you can catch the rhythm, because it's not about cracking a code, that's for sure. And I think that's a challenge for us. And as we have so many interests in poetry and art and music, this is what trains the human capacity for handling multiple rhythms, is the arts. And I think this is where those in the sciences who are drawing upon the arts are going to be making enormous communal service if they can, as you've been doing over the years. I know you've been bringing forward these dialogues and trialogues between the arts and the sciences. And I think this is what Nora and Gregory are doing as well. Very important work.
And that goes back to what Jeffrey was referring to about the political dimension that was mentioned in the Gregory Bateson reading, which I'll quote here, but it says that, I assume this is what you were referring to, but the step to realizing or to making habitual the other way of thinking, which is thinking outside of the singular destructive focus, so that one naturally thinks that way when one reaches out for a glass of water or cuts down a tree. That step is not an easy one. And quite seriously, I suggest to you that we should trust no policy decision which emanate from persons who do not yet have this or have that habit. And yeah, obviously he's speaking more of the environmental destruction in reference to making political decisions that are destroying the environment, at least in his talk here. But if we were to relate this to your decision in the moment there, you're perceiving a triple bind or a double triple bind, whatever it might be. Your attacker is this person that has not made that habitual. He is on a one-track mind to destroy the white man, perhaps, as he said, or so he didn't perceive like these guys might be gay, or he only sees.
Oh, he knew we were gay. I'm sure he did. There were four young men on the. One was black. There are 3 white, but I think there was homophobia there, and racism. It was a different kind of racism. It was a black hating white people because they're white. But one of my companions was a gay man, and it was him who alerted me to the danger. I might not have picked it up as quickly as he did, because he's gay and he's black, and he had a foot in both. He had a much, and we were in that neighborhood that he knew. He knew what the signs were. So I think this is where you get into analog and digital communiques, and how subtle, very, very subtle it can be. And because he was on right there, right next to me, and he spoke this, he alerted me before the disaster happened that I have to pay exquisite attention to everything that is in this potential confrontation, which would end very badly for me and my companions. So this is what I'm saying. It's just, it's very, very subtle stuff. But if you are sensitive enough to it, you can pick up on it before it happens. You can diffuse it before it gets out of control. But I do think it has something to do with aesthetics of relationship and those kind of rhythms. And when it's a jagged rhythm and a staccato rhythm, and when it's smooth, or when it's slow, or when it's fast, So if you live in a big city as I do, and I'm surrounded by oceans of different kinds of tempo rhythms, you start to realize how unique that is to each individual. Everyone has tempo rhythms that are very unique to them. But then also they can be in environments where certain features of the environment will trigger a different kinds of patterns. So it's not a science yet, but I think we're getting there, slowly but surely.
So that quote again, indirect is much more effective, although impossible to prescribe, which is, it sort of names it to the T, right? I was going to say, this thing about politicians, I'm not saying it's a panacea, but I tend to vote green these days, because if there's a group of people who are at least struggling with the issues of the ecology and trying to understand the way forward, the Green Party seems to be the sort of group that is dealing with this most directly. I'm not saying they're a perfect solution and everybody there is doing that, but I do tend to vote green these days as a result of that.
Yeah, politics electoral politics, someone said, is like wiping your ass. You do it hopefully just to keep the fascists out. But I think that's not the real politics. I think we're all doing politics in our own way. And it's not just about who you're going to vote for this election cycle. I think there's much more going on backstage. And I think that's what cultural workers are doing. Because I believe that the cultural workers create the conditions so that the politicians can start to pick up on that and win or lose your votes is what they're basically interested in. But if they can't broker a deal and they're going to lose the next election, so I think there's those delicate balances and communications between culture and politics are very, very tricky. And being able to triangulate from the margins, as Lee Starr does, articulates that really well. But I think we're in a real, it's really tricky here, because we're in these networks and mediated by this technology that most of us don't quite understand. So I'm hoping that we do, though there are binds and double binds that are manifesting in our social media on a grand scale. And, I don't think we have very good maps for this. I think that's what we're working hard on in this particular community. Doug, you were there on that particular thread where a member of the community attacked me personally. And I felt a lot of people were going into freeze because they didn't know what to do. And, I made it a public rather than just, oh, this person is attacking me. But it's like, the group is being attacked. Are you in this group? And I named everybody who was in that particular thread. Are you aware of this? And, I need some support here. And that created there were many different responses, and it was extremely messy. But I think that was an example of what happens when enough people are paying attention to how they're paying attention. We can, I believe, and I believe we did, create a little more stability than we had before. Because I believe going forward, I believe people will be more sensitive to when a personal attack is being made, and they are extremely rare. But in our particular community here, they are very common in Facebook and CNN and all the media outlets. They do nothing but seem to pay attention to personal attacks. But I think that how we become sensitive to the message, the message and the other than verbal messages is going to be very tricky. I mean, if we're all in one room together, it'd be pretty easy to figure out, but I think it's very hard to do with these flat screens, which I think tend to screen out a lot of the affective, the affective and the liminal. But I am ever hopeful. So thank you, Doug, for bringing that up. Oh, and the thing about silence, I think she brings that up. I was silent. And I could have been silent when I was personally attacked. And I don't think anyone would have made much of it. But I remember I went to a Quaker meeting. There's a Quaker meeting house in my neighborhood. A friend of mine who's a Zen practitioner, invited me to go with him. And I started doing that. And, but I remember, you know, that hour of silence is wonderful. But we were sitting in a cafe afterwards, and I picked up on the double message in our conversation. And I pointed it out to him, and he got confused, he got defensive, then I got defensive. And we ended up having a pretty tension-filled after discourse event, let me put it mildly. So it's bringing up these, bringing up these binds and double binds in the moment. There's no guarantee it's all going to work itself out smoothly and effortlessly, and everyone's going to thank you. that doesn't always happen. But I do think that there is that potential that relationships can evolve, and we definitely need silence. But also we have to respect that you sometimes don't get very far with silence. You do need to use language and behavior and those affective zones from which our words emerge in artful ways, because I do believe we are art. Our lives are art, are an art form. So, and I believe our conversations at our best can become artistic as well.
Although if I draw on my past experience interrupting the isms, which I have a certain amount of experience doing, one always feels like a total klutz whenever one steps into a situation like that and opens one's mouth or makes some sort of a gesture. One feels like nothing one can say will improve this. It seems to be, you know, I mean, even if you end up doing something that does interrupt things and moves things into a different place, it feels totally klutz, inappropriate, what an idiot I am. You know, this kind of inner dialogue is what's going on often in your mind when you're doing it. So in that way, since you're going to be a klutz anyway, you might as well go ahead and do it. As long as you're careful about...
or if you don't take that risk, you're just going to stay in the status quo with this other person. And I think you do have to risk, oh, well, I'm going to have to step out of the status quo. And there are a lot of taboos about that. But I think that the flexibility and the resilience that can come from enough people taking that risk is ultimately worth it. But of course, you know, not always. It could regress.
I think in our politics or social interactions, there's signs that it's changing. Comes in waves, perhaps, but we're seeing it with, this is an extreme example, but very much related to what Nora is talking about when confronted with aspects of disrespect, terror, whatever it might be. But there's more and more school shootings where students are responding by, well, maybe they've been trained in the classroom, but they have to respond on the spot, and our brave students knocking over the attackee, or others guiding others outside the building, or locking a door and learning what to do, rather than that typical triple F, fight, flight, freeze, or whatever it might be, if there's a fourth. But in her situation, she's contemplating what she could do, and there's no easy solution. There's never, like you're saying, there's no way to crack the code of our language or of any specific event. But as Gregory's saying, as you make these processes more habitual, the response will come naturally. So yeah, there is the silence that puts up a wall, and it might be needed in certain situations where maybe there is a gun attack, and well, I know the best way to do that is just hop under the chair and be silent, play dead, whatever it might be. But in this situation, in her story, I feel we could gravitate towards support of the Muslim woman. Like you said in your example, like directly confronting this individual might result in a gun attack, or the white woman might have a concealed weapon, and if you defend vocally this Muslim woman, then that could lead, who knows who else is there in this environment. So there's multiple responses, but yeah, instead of the silent approach that she originally took, that she mostly regretted, there's the chance for a pause and a reflection, and to take in the various loops that others might be in. That does take practice. There, on the tactical side, I guess we have the CIA individuals that can assess a situation and just see, based on a glance that somebody has in the crowd, that this person is contemplating shooting that politician because they made a bad policy decision, whatever, and they didn't like it. So yeah, I'm going back to that making it habitual, which we're doing here through practice. And yeah, it is a messy process. It does come up with each reading we do. We take a bit of Gebser with us as we go out and do the world. We take a bit of Aurobindo. Now we're taking Bateson, or at least I am, and you say 30, 40 years later that Bateson is still completely new, refreshing. The memory was lost, so we do need this constant refresher to make the right policy decision.
Oh, there's a kind of responsibility also of stepping in. So years ago, as a young man, I was preoccupied with the way children are treated in society. Or often, it's a complex issue because there's parenting for which there are sometimes behaviors that need to happen in order to address or correct an issue, but they can easily, in certain circumstances, switch over into something that is much less healthy. And I was with a friend, and who was a parent, single parent, and I made a comment on her behavior towards her daughter at one point. And I was a young man, I totally unaware of many things when I did this. So I spent, and she was a good friend, so I spent the next 2 hours listening to her distress as a mother who was constantly aware that she might be harming her child, because as parents, one worries about. I mean, I'm sure I'm talking to the converted here, that one worries about the way how one's actions affect the child in the situation. And so, and she had an issue, you know, she had, as a single parent, she was extremely sensitive to the issue of how or whether she was harming her child. So when I raised my question about her, instead, I think she did get on the defensive immediately, but eventually it switched into this long discussion about parenting and the difficulties, and so it ended up deepening the relationship that I had with her as a result. But I had to take responsibility for the follow-up to the comment in order for that to happen, you know. So it was a life lesson for me.
I think I'm going to go personal here, but the experience that we gain as we go through time. So now, however long that's been, 20 years, you reflect on that situation, and you know there's a lot, especially with single parents, there's a lot going on that can put pause on the ideal situation you'd like to have as a parent. But I'm thinking, when I first started coming to the site, I had just moved into my neighborhood, and there's this family highly supporting Trump flags, and the power wheel of this boy that goes by. He's got a Trump flag in his power wheel. But this ends up being the father that I befriend most in the area of this neighborhood. Not because of its beliefs, obviously, but once we got face to face as people, he's just an average person in a lot of ways, and you can have a decent conversation and leave the political out to a certain extent. But I've learned what I can and can't say. So even though we're leaving politics out of it, I've been able to address his children have major work on their teeth going on at age 2 and 3 because they constantly drink sodas, eat junk food, and but not too many people give their child Coca-Cola and Sprite and these sugary drinks because the world informs us that this is bad. And it's kind of obvious when your child has that, but he wouldn't listen to the doctor's advice. But I finally confronted, just said, well, maybe instead of giving them a soda every time, like try out some water, or try something else. And, it's just one minor issue that I could be addressing to this guy to perhaps be more aware of the various other ideas that are out there. But yeah, when I first, not equating with what I've learned on the site as what's caused me to speak up, but I've learned to have the courage to branch out of that barrier that I used to have. And it has come from the experiences gained here in a lot of ways, but at the same time, no one's taught me here how to directly deal with a situation like that. So yeah, I guess we learn from experience. That's the gist of it there.
That was great, Doug, to talk about what you can and can't say and holding the mind. And you were able to locate that in your relationship with your neighbor and your neighbor's children. And the courage that's sort of required. And maybe there's no action plan that's obvious what you're supposed to do, but I think that just the fact that we hold that tension rather than ignore it or numb it, or how we hold that and how we embody it, and potentially liberate. I believe it could be possible as we get more and more sophisticated and more aware of our messages and the double messages and the analogical and the digital, which is what this whole exploration and Bateson has really been about. I believe we have this somatic intelligence that our cognition rides upon. So, and I think we do tend to overrate the cognitive, because these other intelligences are, I think, much more of, they have that, they can catch the rhythm. And I think the cognition rides upon these affective and liminal zones. And I believe Bateson knew this, and Nora knows this, and we know this. And I believe we have the capacity to handle when we get triggered. And I believe the three of us worked on what do you do when you're triggered. I remember, I should go back and review that. That's one of the great things about this technology, is that we actually studied what do we do when we're triggered. And I think we each came up with a metaphor, and I could refresh my memory by going back and looking at that in the archive. So I think that's what's unique about our use of the technology. And I believe creating that kind of reflective capacity and moving it into a we space, a coherent we space, is challenging, but definitely desirable and possible. And I don't think we as groups are really very good at this yet. I think this is where our evolution is going to be. I think we're under evolutionary pressure to make this part of our education and re-education, our somatic intelligences, coordinating the head, heart, and the gut. You know, if we don't do it, who will? I think this is the challenge. And I think we are doing it. And I think we're getting some benefits from making this, bringing our attention to our attention and creating that kind of meta attention. It is, I think, what theater is at its best. It's what poetry is, music. I mean, all these art forms at their best are drawing upon this capacity for attention and sharing attention. So I think we have lots of metaphors we've come up with in all these discourse events we've done in different times and places, together and with other groups here on this site. So I'm looking forward to what happens next. And what would the first signs be that we're getting to another level? You can't solve the problem at the level of the problem. I think that's a truism we all appreciate. But how would we know when we were at another level? I think that's an open-ended question. So thanks.
Aren't we already at a kind of another level compared to where we were when we started this discussion?
Kind of, I think so. I just don't think we've articulated it quite yet, but I think we're getting there.
I think, and my immediately, going back in my thoughts to our first discussion, we had a larger group. I forget the fellow's name, but we had at least 2 or 3 others that were participating, and Ryan was there as well. But we initially focused on the ecological crisis, and I think that's what the last part, I haven't read it yet, but the last part of the book will be honing in on the ecological issue. That seems to be an ever-present issue once we became aware of it. Once the global sphere was developed, we realized that we're all in this together, that some sort of ideas need to be thought about to get us, obviously not out of the mess, but in a different framework. But if I'm reflecting on where we were then and where we are now within these Bateson calls, it goes along with kind of the experience of getting older and the wisdom quotes that you hear from others, that it's not about some set guidelines. It's Well, I went around about 5 years ago asking people I respected, like, what is something you hold true in your life? And the response that I was hearing in general, and what my great aunt articulated so well, was that we're always in constant flux. There's always constant change, and that is perhaps the one truism. If it was boiled down, it's this constant change, and she didn't say adapting to that change or responding to it, but yeah. And I think that's underlying all of what Nora Bateson and Gregory Bateson are talking about, is there's this flux that does not need to be officially framed. And what do we do about that? How do we define that without giving a general description of it? So yeah, I'd like to see where this last section of the book will go, and where we will go with perhaps more Bateson readings, or incorporating. We've already incorporated Bateson in a lot of the cafe talks, and certain other aspects of what we do here. So yeah, I've appreciated this.
Yeah, I think of it as a kind of a training in thinking, almost. I mean, I started off being a Batesonian kind of in my own thinking for a long time, but I am still an academic, a theoretician, even though I have now what is becoming an extensive artistic practice, but I'm still struggling with the boundary or the movement between academic framed problem that one solves by thinking and something much more practical, much more doing, action oriented in terms of an artistic practice that seeps out into the political and social arena, right? So, and I think this discussion around Bateson with the others in the group, you two, but also the others who've come to participate, have changed to some extent my understanding of that relationship. Whether it will have long-term, I think it will have long-term consequences for my life, but whether it will have long-term consequences for the larger society is a different issue. Might hope, but a bit like infinite conversations as a whole. I mean, in the larger scheme of things, we are a tiny drop in a huge sea. Do what we do here in this community, does it really have any larger influence on the scheme of things? I like to think we do, but because I think ideas have their own kind of power, and the way that we talk and discuss and move things forward, I think is kind of a ripple effect. It propagate out from our community into a larger, and connect with other ripples that are going on. But it's still a very large sea with a very small group within that large sea. So, and the video recordings may have some impact, but
there's a language learning app that my son is using right now that he refuses to try to work with my in-laws from the Philippines to learn the Tagalog, the Filipino language, Tagalog. But there's an app called Drops, and it'll visually drop down a word, and then so it's good for kids to learn. But he's learned about 50 words at this point, but then there's going to continually be more drops adding to this, and that's the same concept. And we do have the record of what we've done as one thing. And then, so he's going to bring these drops that he's learned, hopefully, out into a communication with his environment, with the in-laws. And I mean, that's the intention. That's what our intention is too, is to take these little drops. This is another drop in the bucket here that we've done, and take these into the larger sphere. And as it grows, then we have more archives, more language to share with others. So it might, the growth might expand. The amount of people that frequent the site might expand as we expand our territory, or maps, or whatever. I don't know which word to use right now, but yeah, just thought that as I was working with him this morning on the language, so I thought that's a fitting metaphor there.
Well, I think it's a matter of scale. I think that's scaling up and scaling down. And Alexander Wendt, he's contributed to a lot of thinking around quantum. He's written a book on the quantum mind and sociology, and I'm reading it now, and he has a large chapter on language, which I find really compelling, because he's saying that minds that use language are entangled. So our minds are entangled, our bodies might appear to be separate, and there may be space dividing us. I'm over here, you're over there. But to reduce all of us to just matter, that the body is just matter, makes no sense. And I think that moving out of that Newtonian 3D kind of grid to something that's more quantum is extremely challenging, if not gut-wrenching. I think for most people it's painful. And I think we're in the grips of a positivism which was really very much alive in Bateson's day, even more so now. It's the kind of positivism actually that created, the atomic bomb, and actually used one. I think that we're still trying to figure that out and unravel that knot. But I think Alexander Wendt said something very interesting about, I think he said like 5,000 years ago, there were about 60,000 political organizations on the planet. Most of them were tribal. Now he said there are about 190 nation states. And he was in his shower one day, and he said he just can't imagine that 100 years from now, anarchic nation states such as what we have now, that can do anything they want to their own people, and do anything they want to anyone else for that matter, is still going to be the norm. So he believes there is a direction, and that our social systems are moving towards. It's a taboo in academia to talk about purpose, but he's doing that. And he's drawing upon a different way of looking at quantum theory than has been looked at before. It had been an assumption, he says, in his field that the quantum does not scale up to the social worlds, but he's correcting that, and he believes it does scale up into our, that the micro and the macro and the meso are in communication. So we can have, so that we aren't closed systems. We are open and we're closed. Some ways we are closed, some ways we are open. And that I think is very tantalizing. So I'm putting that out there, that that just by bringing attention to these kinds of splits in our psyches and in our somas and in our relationships with others changes our psyche and our soma and our relationships to others. So that it's the quality of attention, I believe, is going to be crucial for not just our survival, which I don't think is that, I don't really care if we survive or not. I really do not think it's a good idea to survive at our current low level of development. But I want, but about our complexity, our beauty, our capacity for beautiful embodying and liberating these potentials. I think that's definitely motivates me in ways that, you know, increasing the gross national product, I don't give a shit. That doesn't interest me at all. But I think there are some people, and there may be a small percentage, that's the only thing that's important to them. And unfortunately, they're the ones who are creating the changes in our society right now. And I think that needs to change, because we're living in a constant state of crisis created by someone else. And I think that enough people need to start, you know, saying no. We need to stop worshiping the gross national product. We need to stop worshiping this laissez-faire capitalism, which demands constant crisis, so that profits for a few can happen. You're going to be in constant crisis to make that happen. So I think that enough people have to say no. And even though you don't have an alternative yet to capitalism, if you can just bring forward how profoundly fragile the ecology is, that may be enough to start people, even those in the 1% who thrive on crisis, to pay attention. You know, the fact that the oceans are in peril right now. Policymakers in my state are, you know, outlawing certain kinds of plastics. It may be indeed too little, too late. We don't know yet, but that someone is paying attention and is moving through this legislation, and it's happening in other states too. I think California and in Hawaii. So I think these are baby steps, and maybe not nearly enough, but that we're seeing Octavia. I'm blanking on her name right now. AOC, Octavia Cortez. You know, with the Green New Deal, even though there's a lot of flack and people are going to do everything they can to sink it, just that it's out there and it's on the table and people have to take a stand on it, I believe is making a difference that makes a difference. And, you know, they're going to be, and I think that's the challenge, is how are you going to motivate yourself to take up these worthy causes if you don't think it matters one way or the other. I think that the materialism, the nihilism that materialism breeds, oh, fuck it, I'm just going to work on Wall Street and make a lot of money. I think that's really a lot of bullshit. And we need to challenge it and not be tolerant of other people's intolerance. And I think that's the challenge, because are we stable enough as an organization to make that, to deal with these perturbations from within and without? I think we've been together maybe 2 years, maybe 3, I think, since Marco started this up. And we've done a lot of intense study around some of these big books that we're doing. And I think we are, getting a little more resilient, a little more wise, and a little more creative. And I think these are baby steps maybe, but I think they're necessary. Someone has to do them. And we may not realize the benefits of this in our lifetimes. This is what vision is. Vision is about what makes me feel good. Vision is actually not necessarily a feel good at all, because you don't know how to implement this. You don't know how to make a plan. But that you want it and desire it is, I think, extremely important, because I think our sense of agency and the structure of our desires, and how we can pay attention to that and share that with others, and receive from others? How do we resonate with others? And I think it is very vibratory, rather than this sort of code that's being, this abstract code that's moving across these channels. I think it's much more of a vibratory kind of a resonance, kind of musical, very rhythmic. I think we need to do both. We need codes, and we do need to appreciate the vast capacities of the analogical. And just the fact that we're thinking about this stuff together and trying to wrap our heads around it, because this is not easy, I think I'm taking this as a sign that something good is happening. And let's do more of it, I say, and let's do it on purpose.
I think last time we discussed some homework. I can't remember what it was my idea, but I can't remember what it was now. Something about working out stuff together. I can't remember now. But I was just thinking, I've been thinking that it might be interesting to come up with a 20-year plan for the planet. Instead of for oneself, or maybe a 20 and a 50-year plan for the planet, and raise the issue as a discussion issue. What would that look like?
That's good. Yeah, that's good. I feel like things like the long now, they're looking perhaps deep into the future, but they have a podcast series, or at least a dialogue series, where they do kind of say, well, we're not thinking into the future, but I think it does need to be a specific decision globally. How about we, instead of focusing on tomorrow's next politician, let's focus on what actually needs to happen 20 years from now. I like that one. Yeah, I'm trying to remember what you brought up about the project.
I'll have to look back at the review at the recording and see what it was exactly.
But I remember you mentioning it.
But I like this 20-year, 50-year plan. Maybe we could come up with some ideas for what should be on that list.
But I think you were just talking about bringing Bateson into
our everyday lives. How do we do that? I think you're right. That's what I was discussing, is how do we incorporate Bateson into our ongoing lives? So that is another issue, but I also think the planetary issue is interesting, and the discussion around that is useful.
Well, this is what it looks like for me. This is a dreamscape that I came up with a few days ago.
So you've already done the work, Johnny.
Yeah. I think it's happening every night you go to sleep. I think the future is there's feed forward and there's feedback. And I believe the feed forwarding happens when you go to sleep at night. And I believe if you make an intention to remember what happened last night in your dream, and you draw a picture of it, or at least write it down, I believe it leaves an imprint in the systems that we're playing around with. And I believe that this has always been around. I mean, there have been people I think magic comes out of the occult, which is slightly different from the mystical. But I think you can be both a mystic and you can be an occultist. But I think many of the occult arts, which Newton, by the way, was a practitioner of, many of the persons that we consider pre-modern who were modern were actually much more pre-modern in their orientation. But it's about stabilizing these transpersonal realities. And I believe that just a simple practice as remembering your dreams could, if more persons were doing that on a larger scale, we would be tapping into those polyphasic capacity, those polyphasic rhythms. Right now we're trapped in a world of monophasic, which is basically the beta. And that's, I think, a challenge is how can we these are taboo areas. We just don't sit around in polite society and talk about our dreams. But I think that it would be a very different world if we did. If children.
I know I'm saving my world through my dreams.
You what?
I said I'm saving my own world through my dreams, or learning how to interact with the world and receive messages that.
That's right. And give messages. You're giving in. You can take a program, a project that you're working on, a perplexity or confusion or something that you want, and you can say that before bed. You have an image and you need help with this. And you can track the responses that you get. And sometimes they're quite astonishing. The kind of synchronicities that start to happen in your daily life as you walk down the street, something that you will notice that you would not have noticed if you had not had that intention, holding that intention and getting responses from the other side. So I think these splits can start to, we can start to heal these splits between inside, outside, interior, exterior, others, and self.
Who did you refer to, Jeffrey, earlier? Schwartz
Salant, Nathan Schwartz Salant. So he wrote a book called The Paradox, I think it's called. The Order Disorder Paradox. It was a book that Heather put me onto that I found really interesting. And he's possibly, I think the discussion is with the Gebser people, the Gebser Society, that he's being courted for the invited speaker for this year's Gebser meeting. So it's a really interesting book because it sits at the boundary between Jungian psychology and Gebser. So it's a kind of a cross between the two approaches. So it's very interesting and grounded in Bateson perhaps as well. So we're at the end of our 2-hour slot. I think we've kind of done last thoughts in the last few minutes, but if you have any final comment you want to make before we close the video.
Well, I am hoping that by the time we finish this book, both of these books, and I'm looking back on this, that this next couple of chapters will be some of the richest and most interesting. And I believe I'll know something about us that I don't know now. I'm looking forward to that.
I suppose I'll lead out if no one else is here that hasn't been in the loop. Jeffrey and John.
So you'll lead us next week, Doug? Is that what you're saying?
I don't know anything about the chapter, so.
Me neither, but it would be great for you to do that. So
go for it, Doug.
I'll take care of it. All right.
See you all next week then.
Looking forward to it. Have a good one.
Goodbye.